Welcome and thank you all for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. After the presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, you may press star and then 1. This conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this point. Now, I'll turn the meeting over to your host, Mr. Philip Olaya. Sir, you may begin.
Thanks, Oliver. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this webinar, Grant Writing Workshop for Minority Serving Institutions. My name is Phil Olaya. I'm Policy Advisor for the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I'm joined by my colleague, Priyanka Varma, who will speak with you in a minute about WHIAAPI and provide some information about our community and Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the Institute of Education Sciences, and Dr. Katina Stapleton will lead today's presentation. Dr. Stapleton is a program officer within the National Center for Education Research, Institute of Education Sciences. She co-manages the Improving Education Systems, Policies, Organization, Management, and Leadership Research Program, and oversees NCER's portfolio of grants on education leadership. She holds a PhD in political science from Duke University, where she specialized in political communication and school reform. Before joining IES, Dr. Stapleton worked at Syracuse University, where she was an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and a senior research associate in the Campbell Institute for Public Affairs. Before we get to the presentation, I'd like to provide a few housekeeping items for the webinar. First, please know that the operator will keep all phones on mute until the end of the webinar, when we open up the lines for Q&A. So second, if you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, please note that you can use the chat function on your screen. To ask a general question, you may select that message is seen by everyone. Alternatively, if you would like to ask a question anonymously, please select a panelist from the drop-down menu and write your question. Only that panelist can see your question. We will try our best to answer questions as they come. Finally, please also know that we are recording today's webinar so that we can post the slide deck and audio portion on our website for future reference or for others who may not have been able to join us today. With that, I will hand things over to my colleague, Priyanka.
Hi everyone, my name is Priyanka Varma and I'm part of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, or WHIAAPI. So I'm going to briefly speak to you about WHIAAPI and the work that we do here before we get started. So just a quick overview. President Barack Obama reestablished the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and the President's Advisory Commission on AAPIs in October 2009. And the overall goal is really to improve the quality of life and opportunities for AAPIs by facilitating increased access to and participation in federal programs and services. So our office is housed in the Department of Education, but we work really closely with the White House Office of Public Engagement and over 23 federal agencies through our interagency working group. Over the past 2 years, the White House Initiative and the Commission have hosted over 200 events, such as national summits, roundtables, open dialogue sessions, and workshops in 25 states, Washington, D.C., and the Pacific Islands. And overall, we've reached out to over 30,000 people. Now I'll speak to you briefly about Asian American, Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions, or UNAPISIs, which are a type of minority serving institution. We believe that they play a critical role in our system of higher education, in our communities, and in securing our nation's economic growth. In order to be eligible for an UNAPISI, the following criteria are included. The school has to have at least 10% of the student population as AAPI. At least 50% of the students must receive federal financial assistance, and the school must apply for designation of eligibility and be deemed eligible to compete for UNAPISI grants. Some more information about UNAPISIs. They essentially reach out to low-income AAPI students in ways that we believe matter more. These include retention, graduation, language access, and mentorship. And since 2008, the administration has increased funds allocated to the UNAPISI program by 62%. In fiscal year alone, or 2011, federal agency grant opportunities totaled $14 million from the Department of Commerce, $225.5 million from the Department of Education, and $29 million from the Department of Labor. Some of our accomplishments in 2013 include, in January, we co-sponsored a federal summit on minority-serving institutions for our federal agency partners. In March, we facilitated a higher education programs project directors meeting for UNIPESIs. In early June, we hosted iCount, Equity Through Representation, which was a 2-day symposium on data disaggregation in the education system. We also participated in a town hall event with UNIPESIs at the Asian Pacific Islander American Scholarship Fund's Higher Education Summit in June. And more recently, we released our first edition of our online newsletter titled Educational Access and Opportunities for AAPIs. If you're interested in learning more about the White House Initiative, feel free to check out our website, www.whitehouse.gov/AAPI. And now I'm going to turn it over to Katina.
Hi, I just would like to first make sure that everyone can hear us.
Hi, Katina. I think everyone is on mute, actually, so...
Okay, but as long as you can hear me, that's good. Okay.
Right, I think they should be able to.
All right. If you have any trouble with the audio or have questions, please send them through the chat function. So I just want to thank Philip and his office for inviting us to do this presentation. Here at the National Center for Education Research within IES, we are very much interested in helping minority-serving institutions find out about our resources. We've had many conversations over the past year with the different White House initiatives and many umbrella groups from MSIs, and have found that there are a large number of people who are not aware of what we have available. And so that is the largest purpose of today's presentation, is to get that information out to you. So we wanted to first start by giving you a quick overview of who we are. The Institute of Education Sciences is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. IES has 4 centers: the National Center for Education Research, where we're sitting, and 3 others, and we'll talk to you a little bit about them further on, but today's focus is going to be on the National Center for Education Research. Within the Department of Education, IES has a distinct mission. It's our job to do research for the department. One of the core missions for us is to describe the condition and progress of education in the United States. For those of you who are familiar with the National Center for Education Statistics, this is the arm of IES that primarily carries out this function. And then we also try to identify practices that improve academic achievement and access to education opportunities for all students, as well as identify those that do not work, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then the third part of our mission is to evaluate the effectiveness of federal and other education programs. Within IES, we have 4 research centers: the National Center for Educational Evaluation, and their primary function is to evaluate the effectiveness of federal and other education programs. You're probably most familiar with their regional education labs and the What Works Clearinghouse. The National Center for Education Statistics is charged, again, with describing the condition and progress of education in the United States. You're probably very familiar with their reports on the progress of education, as well as a large number of surveys that they produce each year. The National Center for Education Research and the National Center for Special Education Research have a slightly different function. For the most part, we provide discretionary research funds to researchers at institutions across the country to answer questions about how to improve education. You'll also see that there are several other offices: the Office of the Director, the National Board of Education Sciences, which provides guidance about how IES operates, and our Standards and Review Office, which oversees the grant review process. And we'll talk a lot later on about their role and what we do. So let's drill down a little bit more specifically about the National Center for Education Research and the National Center for Special Education Research. You'll often hear us speak of these two centers as sister centers. NCER, where both myself and my colleague Hiromi Ono, who is here with me today, work, we specifically look at research that addresses the most pressing questions and problems in education from early childhood, so that's pre-K years, through adult education. So early childhood, elementary, middle, high school, post-secondary through the baccalaureate, but not master's and doctoral education. And then our adult education is primarily around adults who have more basic needs in learning to read and to do basic mathematics. The National Center for Special Education Research has a very similar profile, except they are specifically targeted at research that is trying to help students that are at risk of disabilities or who have disabilities. Their range of research is slightly different. They start at infants and toddlers. They also fund research on families of students with disabilities, which we don't fund, and their research ends at high school. So it does not extend generally into the post-secondary adult education realm. So within our research grant programs, we have three large categories of research objectives. So the first one is what we think of as figuring out what works. So we're trying to identify education interventions very broadly defined that enhance academic achievement and can be widely deployed. And so we often have questions about what do you mean by that? So it could be practices in the realms of reading and writing, math and science, in cognition. We do work on social behavioral research, etc. We do work on how to teach teachers to teach, work on how to teach leaders to lead. We fund work on specific education policies, etc. And we also don't want research that only works in extremely narrow places, like in one school. We're hoping to find solutions that can be more broadly disseminated and used across the country. So we fund work to identify these practices. We also fund work to develop these types of interventions. Equally important is finding out what does work, is identifying what does not work, and identifying gaps in our knowledge of what does and doesn't work. And so we're always asked, what's an example of a project that we might fund that looks at what types of policies don't work. And so one that I monitored years ago was about class size reduction. And the basic question was, did class size reduction actually reduce achievement when the intent was to increase it? And then the last category of things that we like to look at are we really want to understand why things work. So not just do they work, but understanding the processes that underlie their success or failures. And what are the variations in things that people can control that might contribute to success or failure. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of how to apply to things, we wanted to give you just a basic overview of the type of research that we funded over the year. Our largest category of research, as you can see, is something called education research. And this is really an umbrella term to describe our largest research competition that includes generally 10 or so different topics, which we'll talk about in depth in a few minutes. But we also fund research and development centers. We have a large amount of funding that has gone to training over the years, as well as separate funding streams for evaluation. And as you can see, sometimes we have specific research initiatives. So in the past, we've had large initiatives around reading, preschool education, and social and character development. And for those of you who are owners of small businesses, we actually also have a separate competition just for researchers that are based at small businesses. Our sister center, NCER, has very similar investments. They have an umbrella category for special education research, and they also fund research and development centers and have separate initiatives around training and a small business program as well. As you can see, their investments have been smaller than ours, and that's largely attributed to the fact that we were funded before they were, and so we have several years ahead of them in getting out grants. So I want to pause for a second to see if anyone has any questions. Please feel free to use the chat box. Okay, if there's no questions, we'll keep going. So the first part of what we're discussing is who we are. We also want to make sure we discuss who it is we have on the phone and who we targeted the conversation around today. So as you recall, the title of this is Grant Funding Opportunities for MSIs, or something very similar. And so within the MSI community, there are large numbers of groups. So we include historically black colleges and universities, predominantly black institutions, Alaskan Native serving institutions, American Indian tribally controlled colleges and institutions, and Native American serving institutions, as well as Native Hawaiian serving institutions. We are also discussing today high Hispanic enrollment Hispanic serving institutions. And you'll see that I've saved Asian American and Native American Pacific Island serving institutions, or ANAPISIs, for last. We were asked to target today's presentation specifically for this group, but all of our advice could be applied to all MSIs. So I wanted to start on this slide by answering the questions that we always receive from MSIs. And the very first one is, are there any targeted opportunities? So unlike several other units within the Department of Education, there are no targeted funding opportunities for MSIs within IES. We have what is essentially a field-based research program. So we set out requests for applications that give a very broad description of what we would like to see research on, and researchers can submit applications to receive funding. So there is no actual competition for MSIs, nor is there a set-aside of funds within any of the competitions for MSIs. One of the things that we've been trying to do over the past year, however, is make sure that MSIs are aware of the funding opportunities that are available and of the technical assistance that we provide. And so we have a question that has come in that's asked, is there a percentage of the student population that you would consider high? And so what this question is really asking is, what would we need to do to be defined as an MSI? What percentage of our population would need to be Hispanic or African American or Asian American? For the purpose of this competitions at the within IES, it actually doesn't matter. Any institution can apply for any of our fundings. If you are trying to do research on any of these groups, you would decide what the definition of that group is for the purpose of your individual research project. So I hope that that was helpful. So we greatly encourage MSIs from all of the categories to apply for funding from us, and we encourage you to take advantage of the technical assistance that we provide. One of the things that we found over the past year is that researchers in general and MSIs especially aren't aware that we provide a very large amount of technical assistance at IES. In addition to doing webinars like these where we talk about our funding opportunities, all program officers are available to be contacted to discuss your research. You would simply need to go to our website or look in our request for applications and see who is the appropriate person to talk to, and just send them an email. This is, hi, my name is James, I do research on this, and I would like to know whether or not my research topic fits within your funding area. And then that would start a dialogue. And that dialogue can go from, am I right in the right competition? Should I apply this year, next year? To getting actual feedback on the content of your research ideas, on your research methods. If you get to us early enough, we can even provide specific feedback on outlines and draft text for applications, etc. But that is a huge resource that is not always available at other federal agencies. And the reason why we're able to do this is because program officers here are not part of the review process. So we're able to give quite liberal feedback to applicants. So you're a researcher at an MSI and you're trying to figure out where in the world am I going to get started trying to get funding from IES. So the first thing we like to warn people is that this takes a really long time. Research is, for many of us, a lifelong endeavor. We certainly hope it wouldn't take your whole lifetime to get a grant, but the cycle probably takes about a year at least from the time that you have your idea to submitting a grant, to waiting out the review process, to finding out whether or not you have received funding. So you should think of this as a long-term investment in your career, of which this is only one part. So we've taken a two-pronged approach to getting the word out at MSIs about our opportunities. We send out information through our newsletters to umbrella organizations like the White House initiatives, as well as private organizations that work with MSIs in general and in the individual groups. But in the end, it is also the responsibility of the MSIs to seek out funding opportunities. So we suggest that as organizations, MSIs make it a priority to find out what opportunities are available in general. So all federal opportunities are listed in the Federal Register. If you're interested in funding opportunities specifically at IES, we suggest that sponsored program offices regularly check out our funding page, which is ies.ed.gov/funding, and then look across your campus to see what type of research you have overlaps the type of work that we fund. And we really think it's important to stress that even though we are the Institute of Education Sciences, a very large number of funded researchers do not come from education departments. So you want to make sure when you're thinking about who are viable researchers on your campus, that you're looking in your economics department, psychology, sociology, math, physics, political science, etc. Wherever they are, they might be someone who would be an asset to an application. So once you know what we offer and who on your campus does education research, you want to make sure those two pieces of information connect. So send them the funding opportunities, and as an institution, you can set up visits where groups of your staff come to IES. We just need enough advance warning. We can do video conferences and webinars, etc., with large groups. We also think that it's important that institutions start building their institutional capacity to conduct education research. And we think of this not just building the strengths of people on campus, but including the institution in research partnerships, where you would be able to be an asset to other institutions and they would be able to be an asset to you. So there are an assortment of research consortia and research networks around specific education topics. There's actually some out there that are for MSIs in particular. We think that it's really important, if you can, for you to try and partner with LEAs and SEAs or regional labs. Very few applications that we receive are truly solo applications. The strongest applications certainly come with teams of people that are working together, and many of them come from teams of institutions that are working together. So if your institution is part of a long-standing research partnership, make sure you're aware of that, and also that the individual faculty members on your campus are aware that the research partnership exists and they can be part of it. All right, so for individual researchers, we think that you should go through a very parallel process. So you should sign up for the IES newsflash. Sorry, let me go back a second. And what that is essentially an email that you can, or newsflash that you can sign up for, so that every time there's a new competition that it would be sent to you. And we also think that you should spend some time on our website seeing what types of things we fund and what our priorities are. Any questions? We are checking the chat, so feel free to send in any questions if you have them. So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk about specific funding opportunities, but we wanted to let you know what our assumptions are of you on the phone. So we assume that, like us, your ultimate goal is to help improve education. We know that no one does this for no reason at all, with no benefits, so we think that you're also here to help carve out your own research agenda and to get funding for you to conduct your research. We know there's going to be a very wide range of expertise and interests on the phone and varying levels of familiarity with grant writing. So this is going to be a pretty broad overview of what we fund, so that we have a little bit of something for everyone, but may not be going terribly in-depth into the particular topic that you are interested in. So as a researcher that's trying to find funding from us, you should start from your strengths rather than from our strengths. The first step, we think, is to first identify what it is you really want to study. Because remember, this is going to be a fairly significant investment of your time in putting an application together. So you want to make sure this is something that you really want to pursue. And then you see whether and how that overlaps with what we fund. The easiest way to do that is to go to our website and check out our requests for applications. And so these documents describe our application requirements. Once you've done that, you should contact the program officer that's listed in that request, and sometimes there's multiple people listed, to talk about your ideas. So for example, at the start, Philip said that I monitor our education leadership portfolio and also our policy and systems portfolio. So you would be able to contact me to discuss that. Dr. Ono, who is here with me today, is the program officer for our post-secondary research competitions. So you would be able to contact her to discuss these ideas. That's especially important for those of you on the phone who want to do research on minority serving institutions. So this, in particular, for example, if you want to do research on the outcomes of Asian American students on college campuses, you would contact Dr. Ono to discuss your ideas, because she is the program officer for the post-secondary and adult research competition. If you were looking at that population at the K-12 level, it would really depend on what questions that you were asking to discover which program officer would be most applicable. If you were looking at acquisition of English as a second language for this population at the K-12 level, you might contact Karen Douglas, who's the program officer for our EL program. All right, so what are the steps for figuring out how to apply? We've given you a handy-dandy screenshot. This year we moved over into something that's called Plain Language, and it is a federal initiative for us to make sure all information on the web that's related to funding opportunities especially is clear and easy to understand. So we've come up with a 5-step list of things that you would need to do to apply for a grant. You want to first identify the current funding opportunity. Then you would register for a funding opportunities webinar, something like this actually, that would give you an idea of what opportunities are available. Then you would download the appropriate request for application and all of the other materials which we're going to discuss. And then you would submit a letter of intent, and then you would submit your application. And so there used to be a slide in this presentation about letters of intent, which we've taken out because the deadline for that has passed. What a letter of intent usually does is allow you to describe your research project, and you would submit it so that IES program officers would be able to give you individual feedback about that idea. Since that date is passed, you should simply email your idea to the appropriate program officer. And if you can't figure out who that program officer is, you could simply email me, katina.stapleton@ed.gov, or Dr. Hiromi Ono, hiromi.ono@ed.gov, and our emails are going to be at the end of this presentation. So, this is going to sound repetitive, but we've spoken to so many people, we know we have to say this over and over again. The absolute first step is to locate the request for application. Once you've received that request for application, you're going to look into it and see whether or not it has topics or goals, and then figure out which ones are applicable to you. Each of our RFAs follows a similar structure, though some of the elements are not in all of them, and we're going to discuss that in a few minutes. But our main RFAs, which are 84305A and then 84305B, have both a topic and a goal. If you're trying to figure out, well, what type of projects do they fund in these areas, you can go online to our website and looks at abstracts previously funded projects. And so we have a question here: do all RFPs require an LOI? And so the answer to that is we do ask for people to submit LOIs, but they're entirely optional. So the fact that the deadline for LOIs has passed will not hurt your application in any way. You should simply send the information that would have been in the LOI to the appropriate program officer for them to give you feedback. Okay? So this year, these are the programs that we are actually competing. 84305A, or Education Research Grants, is our largest grant program. And so this is where we are funding the majority of our work, and we're going to talk about that in depth in a few minutes. We also have several research training programs, pre-doctoral. We're not competing post-doctoral this year, but we do have two others. This year is the first year in a little bit that we've had our Research and Development Center. We have two separate competitions within the one for Statistical and Research Methodology and Education. And we have three competitions that are folded within the Partnerships and Collaborations RFA. And so again, the majority of the time we're going to spend on is education research, but at the very end, if we have enough time, I'm going to go through the others more in depth. For those of you who do work on special education, this next slide is extremely critical. Our sister center, the National Center for Special Education Research, is not holding any competitions this year. So if you do work on special education, there is a very narrow window of opportunity within the education research RFAs for you to submit this type of work. And so if you're doing work in that area, the best thing to do is to email a program officer to find out whether or not your work would be eligible. In general, you can do research that includes special education populations as long as you have also have a population of typically developing students. There are a couple topics where it is a little bit looser than that. I believe in adult education, and then in what we're calling our HRFAs, the partnership RFAs, that restriction does not exist. So you just want to make sure before you go and submit something that has a special education focus that you contact a program officer to see whether or not it's eligible. Now, NCER does anticipate being able to have their own competitions again for FY15. So for many of you, there'll just be a year delay. So again, just to reiterate, we are allowing, again, it's a pretty narrow window of submissions within the A topic, just the one, and then it's much looser within partnerships and collaboration. All right, so we're going to take a whirlwind tour of the Education Research Grants, RFA. So please hang on for the ride and stop us at any time if you have any questions. When you're looking at the largest RFA that we had, again, it's called Education Research 84305A is the CFDA number that we identify it with. You want to start with you. What's the education problem that you want to solve? What's the question that you want to answer? And then you look at what we fund to see if it matches. So does the underlying issue of this research fit within our topics? And so the answer to that is almost always, it depends. And we'll ask you, well, what content are you going to be addressing and what sample are you going to study? And then we're going to ask you questions about your research method. And depending on the answer to these questions, we may or may not fund the type of work that you do. So ultimately, we're interested in funding research that looks at how we improve student outcomes. So your research must have student outcomes. And these are the types of outcomes we are interested at different age levels. So at pre-kindergarten, we're primarily concerned with school readiness. From K to 12, there's a wide range of things, so learning, achievement, and higher order thinking, and reading, writing, math, and science. We're also interested in how students progress through the education system, as well as work on social behavioral outcomes. At the post-secondary level, we're most interested in access, persistence, and progress through and completion of post-secondary education, with a particular interest on students that are in developmental programs. And then at the adult level, we're really looking at adult basic and secondary and ESL outcomes, as well as GED prep. So, are you studying one of those outcomes? Then you want to think about what your specific research question is. And at the very beginning, I mentioned that the 84305A, or Education Research RFA, is divided into two areas. And one of them is the topic and the other is the goal. So the topic really is, what's your project about? What is the content area? Are you interested in improving the ability of teachers to teach reading? Are you interested in improving students' ability to pass algebra before they leave the 8th grade? Of using education technology to improve assessments for students for whom English is a second language, etc. So when you think about your work, you want to identify what's the underlying topic of interest. And you would pick one of these 10 topics here. And you would have to decide between one topic or another. There are a few things that are really critical to know, and we pull them out. And so one of them is that this year we have changed how we deal with research on K-12 teachers. And so we are now just accepting those applications in 4 topics as well, instead of an assortment of other topics. So if you're looking at it at the pre-K level, you would submit to early learning programs and policies. If you're looking at teaching at the post-sec level, you would apply to post-secondary and adult education. If you're looking at things like classroom management, you would apply to social and behavioral context for academic learning. Everything else about teachers at the K-12 level would go into effective teachers and effective teaching, and you would not be able to submit it to cognition, edtech, etc. And so we had a question that came in about post-secondary education, and we replied individually, but it's worth asking it to the whole group. And the question is, for post-secondary, what about retention and graduation as opposed to remediation? Is this supported? And so the answer to that is absolutely. That is one of the topics that we're interested in this area. And again, Dr. Ono, who's actually the person responding to questions on the chat, is the program officer for that particular topic. So that's exactly the type of question that you would contact a program officer to ask. Does this topic include the thing that I'm interested in studying? Once you've narrowed down the topic that you're interested in studying, you want to think about the question that you want to answer, and that question is going to determine the goal that you apply to. And so we have 5 research goals, and these goals are available for all of the topics. That has not always been true, but this year we're accepting research for goals for every topic. So what are these goals? At the exploration goal, we're really looking to see what type of associations there are between what we're calling malleable factors and student outcomes. So malleable factors are, of course, things that can be changed. And throughout the RFA, we've defined it as things that can be changed by the school system. So often people will say, I'd like to study questions about gender or questions about race. Is that a malleable factor? Well, certainly one's ethnicity isn't malleable, nor is one's gender. But how you are treated within a school system, how you're categorized, how you are the percentage of students in groups within these groups within a school system is malleable. Whether or not there's any extra assistance given to them is malleable, etc. But race, gender, and ethnicities themselves are not malleable, so that's an important thing to talk about. And so we're trying to figure out what is the association between malleable factors in education outcomes. And then we want to see whether or not there are any factors or conditions that may mediate or moderate these relationships. And to do these types of studies, most of the time there's some sort of a longitudinal analysis of secondary data. So we do provide funding for people to collect primary data to do these types of analyses. And for the last 2 or 3 years, we've allowed meta-analyses of existing projects, or rather existing research. At the development and innovation goal, here we're giving funding for people to create new things or improve existing things. And so here again we use intervention incredibly loosely. This could be an education policy, a curriculum, an approach, an after-school program, an assortment of different things. And so what we're doing, again, is giving the funding to develop it from scratch, from the idea that you have, or from some pre-existing elements. It is very important to us that this development project be iterative. So what we don't want to happen is you develop something, you go, you put in place an efficacy study and find out, wow, this doesn't work. Whereas if you had taken a little bit more time to do the development and receive feedback, you might have been able to improve the intervention on the front end instead of finding out that it doesn't work on the back end. So for our grants, we ask you to develop, implement, receive feedback, get data on the usability and the feasibility of the intervention, whether or not it could actually be implemented with fidelity, etc., and then use that data to actually improve the intervention before trying it again. So by definition, you would need to implement the intervention at least twice during the course of the grant. And then at the end, we would expect you to do a pilot in which you got some preliminary data to see whether or not this might be something that could be effective. So we've referred to it as getting promise of the intervention for having positive effects. Okay? On the other hand, for our efficacy and replication goals, what we're asking you to do is find out whether or not existing fully developed interventions actually work. So do they do what is intended? If it's a reading intervention that is supposed to improve reading outcomes, does it actually do that? How much and under what conditions does this improvement take place? So you could use this funding to do an evaluation. You could use it to gather follow-up data from a previous study of something that you found to have worked. You could replicate a study that someone else has done. just under different conditions. So you vary the condition. Say you had an intervention that was found to work in middle schools, and now you want to see does it work in high schools. You could, or move from a rural environment to an urban environment, etc. That's what we mean by varying the original conditions. And then you can also conduct retrospective analyses of secondary data, as long as you are asking questions about causality. If you have secondary data and you're only looking at questions of correlation, then you want to go back and do an exploration study. If your intervention isn't quite finished and you can't decide whether or not you should do a development project to finish it or do an efficacy project, that's the kind of question you should ask a program officer, and we can help push you in one direction or the other. So back to the efficacy. And underneath these grants, we're asking you to find out what's needed also to implement the intervention under routine practice. We're asking that applicants reduce the appearance of conflict of interest. So if you're a developer of an intervention, you could, in fact, be the PI on this type of project, but you want to show that you're not going to be biased in any way. And as the last point, we used to require mediator analyses. We don't anymore, but we do recommend that you have exploratory mediator analyses. Now, the last category the second to last, we're going to discuss, but very few people actually apply under this goal. Here, we're asking you to study whether or not a fully developed intervention that has evidence of efficacy, so we know it works somewhere for someone. Is it going to be effective when implemented under typical conditions through an independent evaluation? So we want to make sure that there was no bias, so we're going to ask people to redo these. And again, in the previous category, they could be under ideal conditions, but here we want them to be under typical conditions. And to get funding for an efficacy project, you had to have had at least 2 previous efficacy studies that show they were beneficial and practical impacts on student outcomes. It's really important to note that these do not have to be studies funded by us. They could be funded by some other federal funder or from a nonprofit or for-profit funder, etc. It's the quality of the research, not the funder, that we're concerned about, as well as the results. So here we would expect researchers to implement the intervention under routine practice, be non-partial, and have some strong evidence to even suggest that we should do this type of study. We don't expect wide generalizability from a single effectiveness study. That's pretty important. That's a change from previous years. And again, here we don't require mediator analyses. An important new note for this year is that we're limiting the cost of implementation of the intervention itself to 25% of the budget. The last goal is the measurement goal. Here, it's similar to a development grant, except just for development of assessments. So you're allowed to develop new assessments or refine existing assessments and then validate them. Or if there are existing assessments, you can simply apply to validate them. So one of the things that we pride ourselves on is that we think of this as somewhat of a trajectory. You can apply at any point, but there is some expectation that within our portfolios that exploratory work would lead to later development or efficacy work, and that our efficacy studies could eventually lead to effectiveness studies. And then our measurement work would support work that could be done under any type of goal. One of the questions that we always get at this point is so important that we just added a slide. So people have research that's going to fall in between topics or in between goals. And so you must declare a topic and a goal. So it's important for you to contact the program officer to figure out which way that you should go, and to make sure that your work actually fits the criteria of the topic and the goal that you picked. And so one major problem that people have is that the scope of their work is too large. And so sometimes we say, all you really need to do is narrow your scope, and then it'll be clearly one thing or another. So you don't have to try and develop the intervention and do a full efficacy trial. Develop first, and then come back later for money. Or if you feel like I just need to do this exploratory work before I start developing, just apply to do the exploratory work. You have your whole career to do the full set of research. And there are actually several researchers that have done that successfully, that have 2 and sometimes 3 sequential grants where they have started with a development or exploration project and worked through to efficacy trials. What's most important is that you have a well-crafted project that is going to do what it promises. So how much is available for this type of work? As you can see, there's a pretty wide range, and the amount of funding that's available is attached to the goal, not the topic. So the goal determines the amount of funding that's available and how long the grant can be. And you'll see for some of the goals there are different lengths and different funding depending on the exact type of work that you're trying to do. So here again, it's really important to read the RFA very carefully and make contact with a program officer to figure out which is most appropriate for you. These years and the funding amounts are hard targets. So if you go over by $1 or a nickel, you will be non-responsive. And for the time by a day, you'll be non-responsive and you will not be reviewed. So I'm going to breeze by the rest of these slides pretty quickly because I want to give us a little bit of time at the end to answer questions, and because I think that these things are things that you should spend some time reading in the application and asking questions of program officers about. So when you submit your application, it's going to have 4 sections: significance, research plan, personnel, and resources. These are going to differ, the requirements for each of them, by topic and goal. You're going to have 25 pages to discuss these elements. It's critical that you read the RFA very carefully. If you misunderstand those requirements, you could get into a position where your application isn't accepted, or even if it goes on to be reviewed, that it doesn't get high scores. Again, we answer questions here all day. That's what we're here for. So please ask us any questions if you have them. The purpose of the significance section is this is where you describe how your work is important, why it matters. If no one thinks that your work matters, you're not going to get funded. So if no one understands what exactly it is that you're trying to do, you won't get funded. So the key parts here are a clear explanation of the work that's going to be done, as well as a compelling rationale for why it should be done. And these are some of the elements that should be included. Similarly, for the research plan, you really have to have a clear description of what the work actually is. It is so common to see research plans that are very vague and don't have sufficient detail for the reviewers to know whether or not you can answer the question that you're going to propose. So in painstaking detail, make sure the reviewers understand how you're going to answer research question. If you're going to develop something, literally how you plan to do it. If you're going to evaluate it, every step that you plan to take to evaluate it, etc. You also want to make sure that your research plan is aligned to the significance section. It's a pretty common error that people will discuss all these things that they say are important, and then the research plan doesn't actually address it, or vice versa. It's also helpful for outlining steps if you just give us a timeline. That's very helpful. New this year to the research plan is a discussion of how you plan to disseminate your findings whenever you have them. The next part of this is the personnel. One of the key elements of a successful application is your research team. And you're going to be judged on the research team under the personnel section. So when you're describing your personnel, you want to let the reviewers know that your team has what it takes to do the work that was proposed. And so we get common questions like, well, what if we don't have a psychometrician on our campus? What do we do? So if all the expertise needed for your project isn't available on your campus, you should consider partnering with another institution. And I would say it is probably the norm for a grant for people to have to reach out to researchers from at least one other institution to complete their research team. There are very few solo researchers that are funded, and if you are a solo researcher, your best chance is probably with an exploration project. But even there's usually at least a small team of researchers that are working on the question. You want to make sure you demonstrate to reviewers your productivity. You do this in the personnel section as well as in your CV. And it's critically important as much as possible that you have a strong researcher with a grant record on the application. Now, it doesn't mean that if you haven't gotten grants before that you couldn't get one from us. It just means it would be slightly more difficult. When describing your personnel in the application, you want to make sure you're clear what their qualifications to do that very specific thing is, what their roles and responsibilities are, and then as critical that there's actually enough time committed to the project. So, for example, if you have a project where you say that you're going to do focus groups, you want to make sure there's someone on your team that's experienced in conducting focus groups and analyzing the data that come from conducting focus groups. That's really important. We actually run into problems in the review panels with people that suggest qualitative work and then don't have the sufficient staff on the teams to analyze that work. Similarly, if you are suggesting that you're going to do a complex quantitative analyses, you want to have people on the team who have shown that they had the experience to do this type of analyses. Please, please, please do not write, I'm going to take a class. We've seen that in applications before, and it's just not credible. Okay, so every application has to designate a principal investigator. You want to put the strongest person on as the PI, though that does not have to be a senior researcher. If it is a senior researcher, you want to make sure they have allotted enough time on the project. If they're coming in at 1%, 2%, even 5%, reviewers are somewhat skeptical that they're actually on the project and have committed enough time to it. And also for senior researchers, people tend to think that people know who they are, and some of the reviewers will probably know who you are, but certainly not all. So you need to make sure, in general, that they're clear what your credentials are, but in particular how those credentials apply to this specific research project. For junior researchers who don't have as much of a track record, you want to play up what you have done and show how the skills gained in those experiences will help you manage a grant. And if you are more junior, you can help the reviewers feel more comfortable if you bring on more senior scholars, co-PIs, co-investigators. You could bring them on as advisory boards, advisors of an assortment of different types. But again, you want to make sure their percentage time is enough to be credible. And then the last section is resources. So for all of these research projects, you have to show that the university has the capacities to do the work, as well as you have the individual things that your project needs to do the work. So what do I mean by individual things? That was pretty vague. So people often suggest that they are going to have access to a particular data set, or they're going to have access to an individual school or a school system, and then after the grant is awarded, it falls through. And so we have increased our requirements in the application process for people to prove that they have the resources. So we are asking that you include letters and appendices from all partners that discuss their roles on the project. And we are requesting documentation of all data sources. So not just showing that you know how to use the data, but that you actually have permission to use the data. And then we're also requesting confirmation that you have access to the data and the schools. Generally speaking, you'll include those letters in the application. If at the end of the review process you're selected for funding, you would also have to update those letters so that we could be sure that the schools and the owners of the data were still on board for the project. All right, so I'm going to pause here for a moment to take questions because that was a lot of things. And so we've got a question saying, can I respond to the questions? Absolutely. So we're going to pause here for a moment. And then we'll respond to questions to everyone. Okay, so we are not getting any in, so we will keep going, and we'll take questions again at the end. So remember at the beginning, we said there were a number of other programs. We just simply do not have time enough today, I don't think, to go through them all in depth. So we've included a slide here that describes them. We've just finished discussing the Education Research Grant Program. You'll see that we have two programs here for people who are concentrating on statistical work. We have the Education Research and Development Centers and the partnership programs and the research training programs. If you go to our website, and I'm going to put the address up in a moment, you'll see that we have held webinars for most, if not all, of these topics. And you can go to them and download the PowerPoint and the transcript so that you could get very detailed information about what these opportunities are. And again, if we have any time left at the very end, I've added slides that discuss them. So if you receive the PowerPoint in advance, you'll also have a copy of the larger descriptions of what these opportunities are. So, assuming something that we said here struck you, We have, so assuming we have an opportunity that you feel like you would be able to apply for this year, what are the next steps? I think that the very first thing you should do is get in contact with one of us right away. The deadlines are quickly approaching, and the sooner you talk to us, the better. So we can give you immediate feedback on whether or not the research idea that you have fits within our topic and goal structure. We could also point you to abstracts that are online that you could look at so that you could see whether or not your work is similar to things we've already funded. If you have things that you would like us to read, we could read them. So if you have an abstract, we can read it, or if you have a draft proposal, we could read it. On that last point, most program officers are not taking drafts after August the 1st. So if you want us to look at something, we would need to get it pretty quickly. And so we have a question that's coming in that's asking, have community colleges submitted grants to IES? And if so, can you give us an example of what their research teams look like? And I actually don't know. I know that we do, I'm sure that there's probably some, but I can't tell you what their success rate is. If you are worried about whether or not you would be competitive, this is really a question that you would address to the individual program officer. On webinars like this, it's difficult for us to give specific advice, but when you call us, we give a lot of feedback to people of the types of partners you might be able to get. So, for example, one of our research centers works very closely with community colleges. And so we might be able to suggest that you contact them to get ideas, or we would be able to look at the particular topic of the research that you're looking at to help you out. And so Dr. Ono was typing a message suggesting that if you have a community college that you're at a community college and are looking for assistance, that you should email her to get some feedback. If we have time, we'll talk about at the end our R305H RFA, which I think is particularly beneficial to those that are trying to break in to funding from us. All right, so back to the slides. First thing, contact one of us. The second thing is to know absolutely what our deadlines are. Our applications are due at 4:30 p.m. and 0 seconds. That's there on purpose. If it comes in 1 second late, it will be denied absolutely. In the, let's see, I think I've been at IES 8 years. Not once have I seen someone who has successfully been able to protest that. So the application has to be fully uploaded to grants.gov computer by 4:30 and 0 seconds p.m. as determined by the grants.gov clock, not yours. And so the reason why we stress this is that there'll be people that start uploading 3 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock sometimes, and what will happen is something will go wrong in the application process. It will accept an attachment because the extension is wrong, a section will be missing, etc., and you'll get the note back at 4:29 saying that it was incomplete and resubmitted. Well, at that point, it's too late. There's not enough time for you to resubmit it again in that last minute. So we suggest that people submit their applications as early as possible. I suggest a week early, but as long as you were probably a couple of days out, you're okay. For those of you who are at institutions that don't regularly submit to us or to federal grants, it could take at least 2 weeks to get registered in grants.gov, so you want to get some lead time to make sure that you and the people in your sponsored programs office are on board with what is actually required. The application packages are already online, so you could download them now. And we also put up here for reference what the start dates are for the projects. And so grants can start between July 1st, 2014 and September 1st, 2014. So we just got a question here asking, what do I mean by August 1st? So most program officers are willing to give feedback on the content of applications. But as the deadline approaches, it becomes harder. So I've already received draft applications to review. I know another program officer, I think, that's already received 10. So in general, if you haven't sent us something by August the 1st and it's a full draft, we probably won't have time to read it because we'll be reading the ones that we received in the weeks earlier. So if you're interested in sending application materials to a program officer to review, you should email them literally today when you get off the webinar to say, hi, my name is Linda. I would like to do work in this area. Do you have time to talk to me about my ideas? And if I had something to you by August the 1st or by whatever date, would you be able to review it? Okay? And that could be something as simple as an abstract or an outline. But you need to know whether or not they have time, since we started receiving so many already. So to actually apply, you need 3 documents: the request for applications, the grants.gov application submission guide, and the application package. So the request from applications explains everything about the topics and the goals, and in general what's required. The submission guide is the nuts and bolts. How do you fill out this form, etc. What font do you use, what goes in the attachments, etc. And then the application package, which you'll note is available at a different website, is the actual set of forms that you have to fill out. You require all 3 of these things to apply. Once you have submitted your application, you're going to go through the peer review process. As we mentioned at the front of the webinar, we have a separate office here within IES called Standards and Review. And they are over the review process, not the staff of the research centers. That's why we're able to give you feedback. So when your application comes in, the minute you hit send, it becomes part of the peer review process that they're over. So they first make sure the applications are reviewed for compliance and responsiveness. Compliant refers to more of the technical things. Do your margins fit within the margin requirements? Do you have the right font? Are the right sections there? The most important thing is, of course, was it received by 4:30 and 0 seconds? Responsiveness is closer to, did you fulfill the requirements of the topics and the goals? Once you've gone through both of those screenings, then you'll be assigned to a review panel. There'll be 2 or 3 people who are going to read your application and give their opinions by scoring it. Those applications that receive the best scores will then be reviewed by a full panel. That could be anywhere from 15 to 20-something people. And I don't think that we have the link up here, but it's pretty easy to find on our website. If you look for Standards and Review, is a list of reviewers by panel so that you can see the type of people who are acting as reviewers. So once the first 2 or 3 panelists review it. If they like it, you go on to the full panel. If they like it, you get funded. If the first 2 or 3 panels didn't really care for your application, you go through a process that they call triage, and that essentially means the buck stops here, right? Your application would not be furthered reviewed. We have a new system that is supposed to make it easier for you to find out where your application is in the process. So it would tell you if it was funded, not funded, triaged, and provide reviewer summary. So once you actually submit, you would be entered into this applicant notification system. It's pretty common not to be funded the first time, though there are some people that are. If you're not funded, please don't consider this the end of the road. We have so many successful reapplicants that it would just be a shame if you give up. You should take the feedback, consider it constructive criticism, and try again the next year. So there are many resources for applicants. I referred to this a few minutes ago. If you go to our funding page, you'll see that there are transcripts and PowerPoints for similar webinars to this. The one we're doing today is very close to the one here titled Grant Writing Workshop for Minorities Institutions. There's probably only a slide or 2 different, so you don't have to look at that again. There's some overlapping content with the basic overview, but I think what you might really appreciate is if you're interested in some of the other RFAs that we didn't talk about. There's a lot of detailed discussion of the training RFAs and the methods training in the other, the H RFAs as well. And for those of you who are relatively new to research, there's a great presentation called First Impressions that's meant for postdocs and doctoral researchers and other junior scholars. We also have information on research training institutes. We just finished a 4-week grant writing seminar for researchers from minority serving institutions. We also have NCS sponsors trainings on how to use specific data sets. These are some of the ones that have been offered this past year. We also have summer training institutes on cluster randomized trials, quasi-experimental research, single case research, etc. So you could go to ies.ed.gov What's New Conferences, and they'll show you what's available over the next year. And then if you sign up for the newsflash, you'll get notified as new opportunities come up. We also have an assortment of other resources that are available for researchers that you can find on our webpage, ies.ed.gov, Resources for Researchers. Incredibly useful are the ones on methods that are there. And as you can see mid-page, there's a link for the peer review process. So if you're interested in finding out more information about how we review our grants, etc. So some general tips as we head into the home stretch. Reviewers really focus on the whole application. It's really critical that it's a tight application front to back, that you're looking at an important project, that you have an appropriate research method to address it, that you have the personnel with the qualifications to actually do the research that you propose, and that you have access to the resources. It's really critical to know that there's going to be a wide range of people reviewing your grant, depending on which panel that your grant is assigned. So there'll be a few people there that are experts in the very exact thing that you do, and then the rest of them, it's easier to think of them as generalists. They're experts in something, just not necessarily in what you do. So you have to speak to both to the people that are going to really understand the history and the nuances of your work, as well as to others that focus on other types of education research. So you have to write to both those sets. and then you want to write to people who understand the substance. And on every panel, there's at least a couple methodologists. So you want to make sure that your research methods will stand the scrutiny of someone who is an expert in that area. So we had a question come in that says, is there a need for reviewers? Always. So if you are interested in reviewing, you can send a note with your CV to myself or Hiromi, and we will channel it to the Standards and Review office. Just some general tips. Get to the point, be clear, be consistent, and above all, show that you can actually do the work that is proposed. Let's see. Contact us, contact us, contact us. Read carefully, and the earlier you can contact us, the better. And I think that this slide is really critical. You won't be able to get the funds if you don't apply. It's an incredibly daunting process. Our main RFA is like 100 pages. Sometimes people open it, look at it, give up, and walk away. And honestly, we probably couldn't blame you. But it is really worth the time to at least see what is out there and to contact us to see whether or not you'd be able to put in a viable application. And so it may be not time for you this year, but that doesn't mean it won't be time for you next year. So please apply and apply again if you're not successful the first time. So here is our information. We have a few minutes for a rapid fire Q&A round, and as long as the line is open, we can stay on for even a few additional minutes to answer questions.
Right. Thank you, Katina. Oliver, can you please open the line to the rest of our guests for question and answer, please?
Certainly, sir. We'll now begin the question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, please press star 1. Please unmute your phone and record your name clearly when prompted. Your name is required to introduce your question. To withdraw the request, please press star 2. One moment, please, for the first question. Once again, to ask a question, press star 1.
Every once in a while, we're so thorough that no one has any questions. Now, Philip, I know that you had some questions sometimes. We're happy to have you guide them, and as well as we receive some questions in advance.
Okay, sure. Let me pull those up. So in the meantime, we'll hold on a few seconds here. And I just want to remind everyone, and I know Priyanka sent this out over chat, that if you weren't able to join us on time, or if you had audio issues at the beginning of the presentation, you should be able to listen to a recorded version of this presentation, which we will post hopefully later this week on our website. I can't remember, Dr. Stapleton, if you're going to have it on your website as well?
Not this particular version, but the one that we've previously done is already there.
Okay. Well, we will have this particular webinar available for review, or send the word to your colleagues if they missed the webinar and were interested. We will have that up later in the week. So for everyone who has registered for this webinar, we will provide follow-up information.
Okay, so we received a few questions in advance, and Dr. Ono is going to address a couple of them.
Yeah, so what are some of the things we do to increase awareness of our funding opportunities? We really have started more intensively trying to recruit MSI researchers only in the last probably 6 months to a year. And so, but typically we go to conferences, we give funding talks like this, or we distribute information through email lists. With MSI researchers, though, we're hoping to go to more local conferences. Our travel budgets are pretty limited. So, but we are hoping to reach out to you because we know this is a very important area of research for students who are in need. Another question we got was, how does IES's mission sort of adapt to or align with the NPC goals and grant objectives? And as you all target the API population. We have had these conversations, and this is the type of topic that we discuss with individual applicants because it really depends on the type of project that you're interested in. So far, we have not, at least in the post-secondary education area, had a successful or any application period focusing on the API population. This is why we're talking to you, because we would love to see a really good application on this topic. We know that there's needs, it just hasn't been articulated. So when you have an idea that you think is really going to sell to a group of people who are general education researchers, come talk to me or Katina, and we'll try to, even if you have an idea that you think is really important for your population only, we'll try to work with you in a way that will hopefully sell to the general audience. So this is why we're here, to help you kind of stretch your application in a way that would be competitive.
We have another question that came that said one of the various MSIs receiving federal funding is poor visibility into agency investments. And I think that this type of presentation in the 4-week grant writing seminar, and in fact all of our grant writing seminars, are focused on getting the word out about what we fund. But that's really just the first step. You could understand in general what it is that we like to fund, but not really understand what is required to write a competitive application. And so we try to give out good advice on what makes application competitive. There was just a smidgen of that in this proposal because of time. If you were to take the longer 2.5-hour grant writing workshop that we have in general, or even the 4-week one that we just did for MSIs, we went really in depth into this is what it takes to be able to adequately describe your research so that people care about it. These are the steps that you would need to take to put together a reasonable logic model. And so what we try to do as program officers is help you develop a competitive proposal. But it's up to you to come with us, with the research ideas, with the team. Ultimately, we can't write your proposal or help you put the application together. But we can certainly do everything we can to tweak it and to give you feedback on the writing quality or on the methodology, etc.
Now, this is Phil Olaya, and I just wanted to sort of piggyback on that because I know I've had this discussion with other UNIPZs, not necessarily for IES grants, but for other grant opportunities. So sort of following that thread that you're just talking about with facilitating and helping with the grant application, is there a way, over 50% of our institutions are 2-year institutions, so they might not necessarily have the research capacity themselves, but you mentioned a lot about partnering and using other research consortia, et cetera, to be able to obtain the grant. Is there a way that you would help facilitate that sort of partnership? So, for example, if you know that there are two proposals that are very similar, one that is perhaps missing some component that one of our schools could help bring to their application. Are you in the position to be able to facilitate that relationship?
Sort of. And so the question becomes, how do we handle this in a competitive grant environment? So we are certainly not in a place if we say, hey, somebody else sent me our idea and we should connect them with another person that we believe is competing against them for the same research level of confidentiality that's there. Because you would not want us to talk to someone else about your research without your permission. Having said that, we connect people in general all the time. We'll say, hey, have you read the study that such and such just wrote in this area? Or I know that Phil is doing work using these types of methods that would be helpful to your project. And there are a number of researchers that have told us that they're willing to work with other people. And so we tend to send them in that direction. So where we know of a connection that we feel that is ethical for us to give you, we will do that. And that, I think, happens a lot, but we have to make sure we're not doing anything that would violate the confidentiality of the feedback that we're giving to individuals.
And
does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of concerns about, two-year institutions doing work that helps their students. Don't worry. We have a nonprofit organization run by, basically a new PhD that got a grant. You can do it. It's just about getting the right group of people. You just have to be very savvy in how you write your proposal. I'm not saying it's easy. It's hard even for AERA presidents to get funding from here. And it's just going to be a challenge, but I can tell you that I never thought that there was going to be a proposal funded on focused on minority students. We just had one funded on Latino, an intervention that's focused on Latino students, actually an intervention that's directed toward their parents, and it's very exciting. I can forward you to his proposal. He's happy to talk to you if you're interested in it. So I know it's possible.
And there are some topics in some RFAs that are more amiable to people who don't have a long research backgrounds than others. And so those are the types of things that we could help you with individually if you contact us.
Yeah, and honestly, we have a lot of research funded on community colleges, and everyone on the panel knows how important it is to help students at community colleges do better in general.
And so we just got a friendly reminder that we have a cutoff in 5 minutes, so this, I guess, is last question. So we'll hold for a second. If there's any additional questions, you can email us, and we would be happy to help you at any time.
Okay. Thanks again, Dr. Stapleton and Dr. Ono. Thank you, Priyanka, and thank you to our guests for participating in today's webinar. As I mentioned, we will have the transcript and webinar deck available on our website later this week. So if you've missed any portion of it or would like to forward this to colleagues who you think may find this information useful, please keep an eye out for that. Thanks again, everyone.